Welcome to the Finding Financial Freedom podcast with the Frugal Physician, where Dr. Disha Spath will be your companion on this exciting financial adventure. Get ready to conquer debt, build wealth, and embrace a mindful spending lifestyle that will empower you to live life on your own terms.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to Finding Financial Freedom with the Frugal Physician podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Disha Spath, bringing you the best tips and tricks to make your money work for you. Whether you're paying down debt, investing smart, or just trying to keep a bit more in your pocket, you're in the right place. Today, we have a very special guest, Kyle Clausen, the CEO of Resolve, a champion for physicians navigating the tricky waters of employment contracts. With a decade of experience under his belt and a personal life filled with family and furry friends, Kyle is here to help us understand how mastering our contracts can be a big step towards financial freedom. Hey, Kyle, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm so happy to have you here. You are the CEO of your company, and I'm so glad you do what you do because I think it is such a valuable resource for physicians at an affordable price point. But first, tell us a little bit about yourself and your family.
Sure. I'm a dad. I've got 3 kids. My wife is an ophthalmologist. My kids are at that age where it feels like we have baseball or basketball or, some event every single night. We're busy with that. And during the day, we get to specialize and focus on helping physicians, maximize their contract value and protect them from contract risk.
Wow. So your wife is an ophthalmologist. Does she have her own practice or does she work for someone else?
She works for a health system.
Did you help her with her contract?
I did. Yeah. One of the perks.
Yeah, absolutely. And how old are your kids?
12, 9, and 6.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, definitely activity time. You have to still drive them around. Your intro mentioned something about furry friends, so I want to hear more about that.
Yeah, I know. I have 1 dog, so only 1 furry friend. He's like a 100-pound Bernedoodle, and he's a lot of fun.
No way, I have a Bernedoodle too.
Do you really? Yeah.
Yeah, she's right here. How old is yours?
3 years.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
ours, she just turned 1.
Okay.
She's like the sweetest dog I've ever had.
They're great dogs. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're so great. I'm very, very blessed to have her for sure. She's sleeping and quiet right now. Hopefully she
Oh,
stays
that's good.
quiet.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Well, let's dive into some contract review questions. I know our listeners are
Sure.
probably very eager to hear about contracts right now, especially with the current landscape.
Mhm.
But first, can you tell us some common pitfalls that physicians face when reviewing their contracts and how they can avoid them?
Yeah, I think maybe the first pitfall is that I still think the majority of physicians don't really read them much. There's kind of this mentality um, coming out of med school and then going into the match and residency where there's not a lot of choice. Kind of you're told where to go. We see that trickle into a lot of our clients early on. It's just kind of I have to take this contract or I have to take what's offered initially, without knowing that you finally have some power and some leverage, right?
Yeah.
Negotiating. So I think that's probably the biggest pitfall is kind of that mindset, taking ownership of your career and making sure you get what you need to. After that, there's a ton of things, right? I mean, all the protections that we want you to have as far as protecting your schedule and what your job is going to look like to making sure you're paid fairly. And then finally, make sure we're protecting you on the way out if kind of the worst case scenario happens or you just have to leave and move somewhere else. So there's a lot in them. We just hope people pay attention to what they're signing.
You're totally right about the mindset because it took me a little while to realize that I had this Stockholm syndrome going on almost with medicine, where, like you said, for so long, we are trained to do what is needed and do what the system requires and excel at all the hurdles that they put in front of us. And, it's our job to prove ourselves. And at the end of it, you really come out with this real people pleasing mentality. And it's hard to look at yourself and be like, I am worth something. I deserve a good contract, right?
And we know, healthcare is a huge part of our economy. It's
Hmm.
almost 20% of the GDP. We know physicians drive almost all that revenue, right? I mean, nothing gets billed without your license. Most of it gets billed because of your license. Understanding that there's a shortage of physicians, so the economics are in your favor. There's supply and demand, right? Swing your way. We just really think fairness is important, and understanding that value that you're bringing to the organization is important, or private practice, whatever you're looking at. I agree with you. We wish more physicians would push for what they need.
Absolutely. What are some of the common things that you're looking at in contracts, the wording that people should be watching out for when they're reading the contract itself?
I'll talk to you about kind of those 3 areas. The first thing that we think is really important is making sure whatever you've been told verbally, right, about shifts that you're going to work or scheduling or days of the week or locations, the language on that is almost always really broad, right? It just kind of says you're going to come to work for us and do whatever we tell you to, which is the opposite of what they've told you in the interview, right? The interview is very specific and here's where you're going to work and when you're going to work. We find that when that changes, right, and it's usually a change that our clients don't like, that causes problems and that
Yes.
causes people to move right from one employer to the next, which is financially tough, right? Potentially geographically, having to relocate yourself because of a non-compete. So we think that area being too broad or too vague or too much kind of in the employer's discretion is really a tough spot to start. Careful on that.
I've definitely seen people get screwed over because they were told they're gonna be working in one clinic, and they thought they understood how that one clinic worked, but when they start, they are at a totally different clinic, and their location wasn't specified. Also, call hours, a lot of times you get a very rosy picture of the call schedule when you interview, and then when you actually start, it's a totally different thing. I've noticed during my job hunts that a lot of the times contracts are presented as a standard across the spectrum. How can physicians navigate that and maybe negotiate things that they want in the contract?
Yeah, I think you're going to hear that from everybody. So whether it's a two-person practice or a large health system, they're going to tell you that this is the same contract that everybody signed before you, right? And we don't change terms. Rarely is that true. I mean, even in the large systems that want to keep certain components consistent, they'll often modify a schedule or an exhibit to incorporate terms that are important to you. We see changes all day, every day. I mean, it's easy for us to say that because this is the chair we sit in, right? We see a lot of different options, and most clients are only going to see two or three contracts at a time. But I think you have to go in with the idea that this has to fit me. If it's their standard and that standard doesn't fit for your situation, you should be walking away from it, right? I mean, you should be telling them that that's a deal breaker and going somewhere else. So again, I think having multiple options helps you with that. It's easier to
Yeah.
walk away to option B if you have an option B. We certainly encourage you to be reviewing the entire market at the time you're looking at a contract.
So don't just apply to one employer in that area, apply to several and see what you can get.
Well, I think you should. So when we talk about fair market value, which is kind of the second biggest area, looking at surveys is great, and looking at data points like on our site of contracts that your colleagues have had, that's great too. But the best data point for you is I've got 3 offers in New York, or I've got 5 offers in Denver, because now you know for yourself what the market is going to show you. So we really think it's important to not zero in too early, to get those at least 3 or 4 offers to look at before you make a decision.
So yeah, we're talking about salary. What are some trends in physician salaries?
Yeah, physician salary it's interesting because when you say salary, it implies that it's just you're paid, a certain rate for all of the work that you do. We still are seeing most contracts on some type of fee for service, right, model where you have a base or a guarantee, but there's also a work RVU component to it or a collection percentage, that you're going to be paid if that's their model. What's really most important usually is that conversion factor, how much you're getting paid per work RVU or what your collection percentage is, because most physician practices are very busy, right? When we look at total compensation, not just a base or a salary, the trends are going up, right? And at the same time, reimbursements, every time you look at the news, right, they're cutting reimbursement rates and going backwards. We think a lot of that has to do with the value that you're bringing. It's not just the physician service, right, that drives revenue, but there's also the downstream referrals that they can't pay you for, right, because of Stark violations, but it still
Right.
provides value to organizations. So we see employers still increasing pay, and when they have to compete, that's when you see the largest increases in your comp.
A lot of the primary care practices are going to the capitated, or a lot of the insurance are going into capitated payments. How has that changed the negotiation landscape or the compensation landscape?
It hasn't really yet. I mean, so when you look by and large at whether it's a capitated model or there's been a lot of, quality discussions over the last 5 years, we want to pay for quality. We
Yeah.
still see that as a very small percentage of total compensation for physicians. And so it's usually less than 5 or 10% being
Mm.
allocated to those types of buckets. If you're on a capitated model, sometimes less focus on production, right? Because you're just seeing the whole panel. So I think it depends on the situation, but for where we sit, it's not having a huge impact yet.
Are you seeing that a lot of physicians are being offered ownership positions in their company, or what's the trend on ownership for physicians?
It's not great because most physicians now are employed. And so what I
Yes.
mean by employed is, private practice isn't dead. There still are private practices out there, but it's the minority position. It's like 20 to 25% of all physicians work in that setting. So if you're in that 25%, then usually it's a 2 or 3 year partnership track, sometimes longer, shorter, depends on specialty and how big the private practice is. But most have no ownership anymore. They're working for a health system. They're an employee, W-2'd, right? And it's just like any other employee in the country. You don't have a lot of say in the organization and how that's run.
It's unfortunate. We touched on call. Do you see that call schedules or minimum call, maximum call get defined in contracts?
Not usually. The starting point is you're just going to take call for us, right?
Right.
But certainly you want to have some limitations on that. You don't want to take more call than your colleagues. You may want to cap on that if colleagues are leaving and it's hard to retain, right? So you force them to go pick up locum coverage for it. You also should know if you're being paid for call or not, right?
Yeah.
There's a certain amount of call that's unpaid that is part of your base salary usually, but if you're going to exceed that rate or that ratio, you should be being paid for that. So we see that as a major issue that ties into both scheduling and into compensation that you probably need to pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very important part for primary care physicians specifically, but also all, the specialties that really have to go into the hospital for call that can really impact your life in general. So we talked about compensation. What are some other, going to delete that. Let's talk about malpractice. What are some important topics in malpractice that we need to be paying attention, malpractice insurance that we need to be paying attention to in our contracts?
Sure. Yeah, malpractice is obviously important while you're with, your employer, right? You want to have coverage if a patient sues you, if there was a mistake. Generally, they'll lay out the terms, right, of the limits of coverage, 1 million, 3 million, type of thing. What you need to be paying attention to from a language standpoint, though, is whether it's a claims-made policy or an occurrence-based policy. And the reason that matters is because if you leave, which most physicians will at some point, you need to know who picks up the cost for tail, right? And if tail's even needed. So if you have an occurrence-based policy, it's almost prepaid, right? That's how I like to think about it. You don't need to pick up tail after the fact because they've already done that. If you're on a claims-made policy, though, somebody has to have a tail coverage cost being allocated to them. And if it's
Okay.
not defined by the contract, that means it's yours, right? You're going to be the one that pays for it. This matters more for some specialties than others, right? Primary care may be less expensive. If you talk about like OB, these are six-figure numbers we're talking about. So tail can be $100,000 plus, and you don't
Wow.
want to miss that value point in the contract. Your next employer is not going to want to pick up an extra $100,000 of coverage. They're going to allocate it to you. It's almost more important than a signing bonus. If you think about where you're going to allocate value, planning your exit certainly is important.
Yeah. Speaking of exits, the FTC just ruled non-competes illegal. There's a lot of talk about that. There's already court challenges. Tell us about non-competes and how the recent FTC ruling changes that atmosphere.
Yeah, it's been a busy week for that. As of today, right, the FTC ruling came out earlier this week, but as of today, non-competes are still allowed, right? So the ruling doesn't become effective until 120 days, but there's also legal challenges happening, which are probably going to slow that release. So for anybody listening to this that's a physician, don't think your non-compete is void and you can just walk across the street. It's not there yet. So my advice is continue to negotiate them, push on them as hard as you can in the contract. If you're not familiar with what a non-compete does or what it, how it's structured, usually these are set up to say you can't practice medicine for 2 years, right, within 10 miles. That's an example. If the contract ends, that radius or that mileage gets a lot bigger, the more rural you get or more, less densely populated is probably the best way to say it. Time periods are usually between 1 and 3 years, not usually in excess of that. So we think those are a major problem. They really reduce leverage. They reduce negotiation power. If you're looking at a contract, please don't miss that. Try to drive
Yes.
that down or remove it if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. I've personally just said I'm not signing a non-compete again because it's already in muddy water, especially with this FTC ruling. I think most people agree that it's bad for communities, for doctors to have to leave their entire patient population in order to pursue better life, better compensation or whatever. So I think it does give us some negotiation power, at least, to have this FTC ruling, even if it doesn't stand. You can say, no, easier. But if you already have one in place, it is still applicable to you at this point. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the next few months.
Yeah, we're hopeful because it does, especially if you're in contract, right? I mean, that's the biggest issue. If you're signing a new contract, absolutely try to get rid of it, negotiate it, don't sign it. If you've already signed one, that's where the kind of the gray area is. And we've already seen employers email some of our clients saying, we're a nonprofit. We don't think this applies to us. And so we're not releasing you from your non-competes. And so they're very defensive about it already. And so I just think you need to continue to monitor that and pay attention to it.
Yeah. Tell us about the nonprofit space and why that was excluded, or was it fully excluded from
Well,
the
so
language?
the FTC has certain authority, right? Their authority is over for-profit entities. So just by and large, the FTC doesn't regulate nonprofits. What's interesting is that physician space and healthcare specifically was heavily considered in the rule. There's like 150 plus references to physicians and healthcare. So they definitely thought about this. And they actually mentioned that some percentage of the 58% of hospitals that are nonprofit, right, in quotes, will be treated as for-profit for this rule because they act and feel like a for-profit entity, even though they file taxes as a 501c3. That's good news, I think, right? But it's also muddy water because we don't know which of those 58% are they're going to treat that way. So again, it's one of those things we got to just pay attention to.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then you have the hospital systems that are like in Texas and California where they can't directly employ doctors that are 501, and but so the doctors have to be employed by a for-profit institution or a
But
company. So it's interesting how that might apply to everyone going forward anyway. But we'll see how that plays out. What are some surprising contract clauses that you've come across? Can you give us some examples? I know you've reviewed a ton of contracts.
yeah, one of the most surprising was a blatant Stark violation, right? So when we talk about Stark, you're not supposed to pay for referrals.
Yes.
And there's huge penalties on this if it happens. And you can see tons of news articles on health systems that have been in violation, the $1 million penalties that come in. But sometimes small practices don't realize exactly what they're doing in their contracts. And so we've had some clients where we just flat out say, you can't sign this, right? It's a clear violation. They're paying you for referrals to a surgery center or referrals to a cath lab or whatever it is. That's always surprising. The other thing that was really surprising is we saw a contract that got sent to us, I think by accident before they edited it. And in the footer, it was titled female physician contract. So they had a internal system that was
Oh
set
my
up for
God.
females and males. And obviously that's a huge problem. Those two, you look at it and you just go, I don't know how we got here, but that was a mistake, right, on somebody's end.
That makes my blood boil. It really does, because there's so many people out there that will be like, "No, female physicians are not treated any differently than any other physician in our system." Yet you come across stories like this, and in regular, my personal experience, my friends' experiences, we've all had experiences like this where it's clear in conversations with our colleagues that we weren't offered the same thing they were with the same background and training. But anyway, that's a topic for
Yeah.
another day.
Yeah. Different episode. Yeah.
Well, yeah, well, that's interesting that you actually saw that written. Well, what about early career physicians? What are some ways or surprising things you found in contracts for, that first contract that recent graduate gets offered?
I think the compensation being extremely low is what most organizations try to get away with young
Mhm.
physicians because the jump from what you're paid in residency to what you're going to make as an attending or somebody out in private practice is dramatic, right? It doesn't matter where they hit the scale, it's going to be a pretty big pay increase, right? And so we just find that people that are early in their career don't understand how much they're going to make, right? Or how much revenue they're going to drive. And so we see people signing contracts early, maybe even in med school, right? To go back to their hometown. And they'll take 10th percentile type money because it's such a big number compared to what they're at now versus what they should be at, which is median or above. And so I just think that not understanding the economics around medicine early in your career is a problem. And so when we talk about being financially healthy, right? Which I know is a lot of your mission. I think saving money is important, but I think as important is earning what you should. Excuse me. And I think if you're off by 10 or 20% on your compensation over your career, that's probably going to be more impactful than saving 10% on your costs, just
Mhm.
because of the numbers are so big. So I think for early career physicians, you have to know the data, you have to know the market.
Oh, totally. I mean, income minus expenses is your delta, right? That you get to build your freedom with. So, absolutely, both are incredibly important. And the income numbers can change drastically for physicians if you don't know the actual compensation data. So, that's why I really like partnering with your company, Resolve, because you guys help, especially, I think, for any aspect, any stage of your career, you should have a lawyer involved during contract negotiations, but especially early in your career to give you that data. So what does your company do? And can you tell our listeners about how they can work with you?
Yeah. So we provide a mix of technology and data and human expertise, right, for various stages of your career. Specifically, if you're early on, there's there's data packages you can take a look at to help you understand, right, what your colleagues have had in their contracts, what some of those large surveys like MGMA are showing. So if your employer is saying, "Oh, we can't because of this," you can go in and then fact check that right on your own and see what the 75th percentile looks like versus the 90th percentile, that type of thing. And what we really want you to do, because we think it's so impactful, is get some guidance early on and talk to an attorney. Make sure you know what you're signing. Even if they say no, we can't change it, you have to be educated on how bad is this, right? We work with thousands of physicians across the country. It's what we do all day, every day, and we're just really passionate about making sure you're treated fairly. So it's people, it's data, right, and it's analysis from an expert. That's what we do.
So you have MGMA data that people can access, which is not
Correct.
usually accessible to physicians that don't own their companies.
Correct. Yes. You're going to see from us is a mix of every contract that we've looked at, de-identified, anonymous, right? We're not going to show you, your colleague's contract necessarily, but you're also going to have access to the survey data with MGMA that you can, either take a look at online instantly, right, in a portal, and or get some custom analysis done based on your situation, especially if you're mid-career. That's important because there's a lot of different filters. I mean, I think it's 250 plus filters within MGMA. And so if your employer says, well, this is median, it's kind of a loaded question. It's median based on what, right? And
See?
so you want to make sure they're pulling things that are accurate for your situation. And that's all things that we can help with.
Oh, yeah. I'm totally a data person. So that is super important to me as well. I know my audience is very cost conscious. So can you tell us kind of how much your services cost, ballpark?
Yeah, we again believe in transparency on that. So you can go to resolve.com and just check this out. But it's anywhere from free tools, right, which is great. You can take a look at some data for free, up to $2,000 if you have kind of higher level needs, right, with needing attorneys and multiple contracts looked at, or you're exiting a position. So you're going to be between that number. And there's also, I think, a discount, right, that we're able to provide to
Awesome.
your members. So
Oh, we
take a
love
look out
that.
for that as part of that.
Awesome. Great. Yeah. So make sure you mention you came from the frugal physician for that discount. Could you share a personal story with us, Kyle, where you felt particularly satisfied with how you helped a physician achieve a better contract scenario?
Yeah. I'll tell you a story about what I thought was a very minor change, right? So when you talk about kind of what the exciting things are in a contract, it's, hey, we got somebody an extra $100,000 a year, right? That feels good. But this was not that. So the client was really focused on being in a certain geography, had some family needs where it was important to be around for kids, right, that had special needs, and couldn't work at different satellites, right? Had to be in one spot. And most health systems now have multiple, locations. We put a small edit in about mutual consent on future locations, right? And it's not a sexy addition, right? It doesn't feel like it's a great edit. This client came up to us at one of the national conventions in person and was just so thankful for that, because 6 months after he signed the contract, admin came in and said, "Oh, 2 days of the week we're going to have you over here, like an hour away," right? And he said, "No, I don't think you can do that, right? Here's my contract." Well, they looked at it, they were fairly upset, right, that they accepted that edit, and he then had the authority to say, "No, I can stay here. I can, do all the things with my kids that I need to and be available for them." That for me is the reason you review your contract. It's the reason the small edits matter. Getting more money is important, but really making sure your lifestyle fits the contract is also really top kind of importance for us.
Yeah. That's really so important. I've heard that happening across the board. What about side gigs? A lot of physicians have side gigs now. Is there any particular language we need to watch out for or ask for in order to make sure that our side gig income is our income and not the system's?
Yeah. So most contracts start out saying you're not allowed to do side gigs. So if that's
Mm.
important to you, you're going to have to carve that out. There's also going to be a question on if you're allowed to do that, who keeps the revenue? If you're generating intellectual property as part of it, who has ownership of the IP? And so if you're interested in side gigs, which a lot of physicians are now, you've got to pay attention to that exclusive language, or the outside activities language is how it's framed up, and make sure that either one, the activities you're doing are approved, and or you're just always allowed to do those things, provided it's not competitive or doesn't interfere, right? I mean, there's some legitimate reasons to have those in, but by and large, if you're doing it on the weekend without their time, without their resources, that they shouldn't have an interest in it.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, that was something I was surprised to learn about after I started my side gig. So thank you for elucidating on that. Is there
Yeah.
anything else you'd like to share with our audience today?
I just think be empowered. I mean, you're here, if you're listening to this, right, you're probably interested in the topic. Make sure you're educating yourself, make sure you're getting access to the tools and the people that you need, and don't feel like you have to sign the standard contract. I think the more people that start to push back on this, the better. Pay attention to the FTC stuff, and you should be doing just fine.
Thank you, Kyle. I really appreciate your time. Can you please remind our listeners where they can find you if they want more information?
Yeah, it's just resolve.com. You can go check out the website. All the pricing, is there. Our services are listed out there. So if you have any questions, use the chat and let us know.
Awesome. Thank you.
The content shared on this podcast should not be taken as individualized financial advice. We are here to share our knowledge and experiences, but it is crucial to consult with professionals such as accountants, financial advisors, or attorneys who can provide personalized guidance based on your specific needs.